I'll quickly introduce the speakers, go through the discussion structure, and then provide an introduction to the discussion. On my left is Rachel Fisher. She's Deputy Director of the Cities and Local Growth Unit at at the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government. On my right is Nicholas Boyd-Smith, who is Director of Create Streets. And then on my far left is Richard Tice, who is CEO of Quidnet Capital and also the founder of Leave Means Leave and co-chair of Leave.eu.
No longer.
No longer that, okay. And my name is Jack Airy. I'm a research fellow at Policy Exchange and I lead our work on housing. So, discussion structure, we're going to do 3-minute introductory remarks. First from Rachel, second from Richard, third from Nicholas. Then we'll have a brief panel discussion, then we'll go to you guys to have a Q&A. So, the conference today, as I understand it, is about addressing shared challenges, cutting through the politics, and finding workable solutions, and, well, at least for Policy Exchange, about restoring a national consensus. And I think housing ticks all of those boxes. In terms of shared challenges, it's probably, arguably the biggest domestic challenge for government. Maybe the 20 billion to the NHS would suggest the NHS is actually the biggest one, but it's certainly second or third. In terms of cutting through the politics, housing, I hope you all agree, is a problem that's dogged and caused by politics. The crisis that we're in at the moment. Successive governments have been too scared to do anything radical. The policy is more about minimising losers rather than having a policy in line with the public good. In terms of workable solutions, actually I think housing is a policy area buzzing with ideas. I think that's quite a good thing. And fourthly, in terms of restoring consensus, I think given housing splits society in so many ways, be that wealth, the look of your home, your preference for what your home looks like, your tenure, and in terms of debt, it's also an essential building block to restoring a national consensus. So when was there a national consensus? Maybe if we think back to the post-war period, housing was a huge part of the government's reforms, and then in 1951, we also had the Conservative Party talking about how housing was the first social service. So I think part of the discussion today is about how can we find that zeal for a kind of a national housing solution again. So I think housing it's a multifarious topic. We talk about lots of stuff is covered by housing. So we've got mortgages, we've got housing supply, we've got affordability, social housing, lots and lots of stuff. So today, talking about building houses and the importance of good and popular design and style. There's lots of reasons why this is important, some of which I hope we'll cover today. So I want to start off with 4. First is fixity. Homes in England and in the UK are semi-permanent. I think around 37% of homes, of the housing stock, was built before the Second World War. Our culture is to keep buildings there. We knock them down, but not very often. This is completely different to somewhere like Japan, where the culture is to knock them down every 30 years.
It's partly because of earthquakes, though.
We're lucky in that regard, that's true. So there's a fixity to them. It's important what we build. The second one is about time. Most of our lives and time is spent at home. The look and feel of a home and a place where someone lives is important to someone's health. It's important to someone's happiness. We should really care about these things. Third, homes or housing, buildings, they're a form of public art. To paraphrase the philosopher Sir Roger Scruton, we all experience architecture. You can't avoid it. Housing it's a common good, so we should again care about it that way. And fourth, this is about public support. So today's subject, and also the subject of the report that we put out about 3 months ago on the subject, which we can talk about further today. So our argument in this report is good design and style, popular design and style, getting people's support for the buildings of new homes and places in their area is essential to just getting them built. So people support new homes when they are well designed, and it is true that they have a preference. We should listen to their preference, and that's what we want to talk about today. So Policy Exchange, as I said, have this is a part of our housing programme, but again, lots of other organisations talk about the importance of design and style. So, to name one, Create Streets. So today we want to discuss it further. So my essay question is, which I hope our panellists can answer, is why is there a disconnect between what people like when it comes to their homes, how they're designed, their style, and how many new homes tend to be built? And will closing that gap help solve the housing crisis? So with that, I'm going to pass over to Rachel to give her introductory remarks.
Hi. This is on. Good. Okay. So it feels a bit weird to be a civil servant sitting in the politics tent, so I'm going to try and maintain my remarks to be kind of as politically neutral as possible, which is challenging when you're talking about housing, which obviously is so emotive and so important to our everyday lives. I'm a pretty simple person. I think basically you need about 3 things to build houses. I think you need the land that you're going to build it on, unless you're in Holland, in which case you can build it on stilts. You need money in order to build it, in order to pay for the materials, in order to pay the people who are going to be doing the building, and you need consent. And that's particularly important in the context of the UK, where we have a democratically accountable planning system. And what we're talking about in terms of design really is about securing that third one. But that's subject to the vagaries and the kind of interdependencies of the first 2. So the money, how much everything is going to cost, and the land, which, as we know, is probably the highest priced bit of the equation. So it's important that we think about all of these things, kind of not, solving the design gap, if I can put it that way, isn't going to solve the housing crisis on its own. Solving the design gap will help people in the kind of third element, which is about consent. But that's not going to just on its own get us to a point where we're building what the government is committed to, which is 300,000 homes a year. I don't think anybody wakes up one morning and thinks, do you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to wake up and I'm going to build a really ugly house, and then I'm going to try and flog it to the unsuspecting public. That is unlikely to be any house builder chief exec's first thought when they wake up in the morning. And yet, that is kind of what people tell us through your research and others is happening. That through value engineering, through other means, people aren't feeling as though what they are getting in return for this product that they are investing hugely in is what they would want. So what the government is doing about this is through the Housing White Paper, which was published in 2017 and then followed up by the recently published National Planning Policy Framework 2.0, we're trying to change the rules of the game, trying to change the underpinnings of the overall planning system to enable people to deliver better design, and also, and this is important, and the housing minister touched on it earlier today, to disrupt the housing market, to bring more players in, because the idea is that if you have more people delivering more kinds of products, you will deliver a differentiated product as well. The other thing that government is interested in is how do we get more people involved in the design and building of houses themselves. So how do we support custom build? How do we support community-led housing? How do we ensure that people who want to build their own homes have the opportunity to do that? And again, that's about diversifying the market. That's about changing the kind of changing the kind of idea that you have when you think new build. It's not just this one product. There's a different kind of product that you would want to do. And I think also government has continued to be really committed to promoting good design through our other policies. So the Garden Cities Prospectus, which was recently published, I think like last week. The Garden Cities Prospectus, which again is talking about how do you build at scale, but build good design at scale as well. And really trying to make design central to everything that we're doing in trying to meet the demands of the housing crisis. Which, it's interesting, before I joined the civil service, I worked for the National Housing Federation. So I spent 5 years lobbying government on why it was important that we build more homes. And funnily enough, I've now joined government and I'm trying to work out how we build more homes. And I keep thinking, well, how would I lobby myself? If I were still a lobbyist. I think government is genuinely committed to meeting these housing targets and to meeting these numbers, but they have to continue to have consent from the public. And design is one of the ways in which we can do that, but I don't think it's the only way. So when we talk about building at scale in particular, the thing that comes back most of all isn't, for me, necessarily well, what's it going to look like? It's how connected is it going to be? Will there be school places? Will there be hospital places? Will there be roads? Will there be infrastructure? It's good design with a capital D doesn't stop at the front door. It's about how we design entire places. And it's about how we make sure that the places that we're building integrate with the places that already exist. So, I think that was 3 minutes.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thanks.
Richard.
Perfect. Thank you, Jack. I mean, I think we can all agree no one wants to build an ugly home, and everybody wants it to be well designed. But of course, design is an incredibly subjective thing. I mean, think about putting 3 architects into a room and getting them to agree on the same good design. It's harder than getting politicians into a room and agreeing on a good policy. The reality is, I'm a bit sceptical, Jack, to be honest, about the polling that you did. I mean, I've been building homes for 30 years across the country. I can't remember a single time when actually it's been easier to get a consent because we've been able to convince people that it's been well designed, or that we could get more homes built because they were good designed.
Maybe none of them are well designed.
Maybe, but I just don't think that's really grounded in reality to date. But one of the reasons is because actually the planning system, it's very hard for planners to reject a scheme on the basis that they don't like the design. It's very hard for councillors to reject a scheme because they don't like the design. And I think that's a fundamental flaw I'll come back to. The cost of getting a planning consent, ladies and gentlemen, is enormous, and we need to seriously look at that. We used to be able to get an outline consent relatively quickly and easily, and I think that if we had a system whereby we focused on outline consents, just focusing on the design and fast-tracking that, that would be a way where actually you could start to convince people. So the cost is enormous of getting a consent. You know, for about 100 homes, it might cost you £500,000 to £1 million of upfront money. And what that has led to over the last 15 years is the situation we have with the major house builders, where the top 5 house builders are building over 40% of our annual production, and they're building their standard boxes. And it looks nice on the front. When you go around the back, you know, it looks like a piece of cardboard because they've changed the design. And that's just ludicrous. We just shouldn't allow them to be able to cut corners. And look, good design very often does cost money, but it doesn't need to cost money. The issue we've got is the way the appraisal system works. You know, land is the residual calculation. And because house builders want to buy the site to make a profit, they want to bid the most money for the site, and therefore they need to drive down the price, the cost of everything else, the construction, all the infrastructure that you just talked about quite rightly, the community facilities. They want to drive that down so they can spend the most on the land price. It's probably a very non-free market thing to say, but the corollary of that, the alternative to that is for planners to say, well, let's fix the land price at X, right? Now go and give me the best design and you win it, because you're paying a fixed price for land. It's very non-free market thinking, but it might help on good design. I think the best idea from your policy exchange paper actually was where planners for large schemes could appoint a consultant architect to act as advisor to the planners, so that you know, that could give some additional comfort to the planners. You have to build. The danger of that is you end up with sort of architectural whims, and I've seen plenty of those over the years. But I think that would help planners, would give them some confidence if they could then actually reject a scheme on the basis of bad design. So, you know, those are some of the ideas. But the other key thing we need to remember in this whole debate, which is too often lost, is that there is still so much brownfield land that is available and can still be built on. I mean, you remember, I recently stood to try and get the Tory nomination for London Mayor. Housing's my background. You know, within the public sector land ownership in London alone, there is enough land, brownfield land, which would deal with London's housing needs for the next 10 years. We wouldn't need to build on a blade of grass in London if we showed some leadership, we had the right people running transport for London's housing department and development department things, so that actually we could truly build the right quantity of property on existing brownfield sites. That is a huge opportunity that with leadership we need to be taking. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Nicholas. And Nicholas has some slides, I believe, where we can talk about. It's about what constitutes good design.
Is that coming up? Yeah. Brilliant. Richard's interesting. I agree with all your reasons, none of your conclusions, so this is going to be fun. Just to come back, so you're going to see my left side a lot as I work out what the hell I'm saying here. Can design beat NIMBYism, or must we build ugly homes? If you don't want to listen to the next few minutes, I'm going to tell you what I'm going to say now, so you can go to sleep, check your iPhones. Popular design provably is one of the ways to beat NIMBYism. It doesn't necessarily solve all the problems, I'd agree. It's very easy to predict what most people will like most of the time. All taste is not subjective. About 70 to 90% of taste can be predicted. There is a virtuous circle. The good news is If we beat NIMBYism, if we beat NIMBYism, we actually create a virtuous circle of not just popular design, but actually higher value and higher resident well-being. The best designed places for output well-being and high long-term value are also the most popular places in polling and pricing data. And finally, this actually comes back to what Richard was quite rightly saying, given the design disconnect between architects and the rest of us, more of that in a moment, and also our odd and comparatively inefficient and weird planning system, which puts all the politics at the end rather than the beginning of the process, we need to solve those to come back to getting good and popular design. So first of all, design does have provably major impacts on people's propensity to build new housing. This is some polling, I won't go through all the details I'm afraid. We ran with Mori some years ago. We were able to halve opposition in principle to housing based on design, and it isn't just a polling issue. In practice, on site after site, this is some work we were doing in Mount Pleasant, you can get support for higher density development if it's in an urban grain that feels instinctive and with design that is multifaceted and fits in with a strong sense of place. What people most like is incredibly predictable. I've used this slide because literally one I was using yesterday in some meetings I was running in southwest London. Our little parlour game when we run visual preference surveys or work with residents groups is to predict what people will say they will like, and it is incredibly easy to do. So the most popular on these pictures were pictures 2 and pictures 5. And when you ask people what they thought they were going to get, they thought they were going to get picture 1 or picture 8 or maybe picture 6. So there is and this is a really key point, it's so key I'm going to stand up for 2 seconds. There is an instinctive response of most people when they hear that development is coming, that, oh shit, this is going to ruin our neighbourhood and change the area. Now that is perverse, and until we turn around that core assumption, that innate assumption, we will never solve the politics of the housing crisis. Because I agree, it's not just about NIMBYism, it's not just about the politics, but until we see it as a problem of policy and political consent for fundamental changes to the planning system, of which more in nature in a second, we never resolve this. Where people like, where they're happy, where they say this is a good place to be, is mathematically predictable. This is one of the very first studies of this nature that was done on this on the West Coast by an academic called Jordan Rolf. 62% of where people said they felt good was a consequence of where they were. The rest was a consequence of who they were. And the places they liked were places which had walkability, finely articulated facade that fitted in, and greenery that was in no way threatening or disconcerting. And there are good psychological and neuroscience reasons for this that we're beginning to understand better and better. This is a study that was done, again in the US, on people's behaviour in front of 2 facades. Students posed as lost tourists in front of both buildings. Random passers-by were 5 times, and the buildings in the same parts of the same city, so they're not in some Shitsville and Niceville, to use technical architectural speak. Is that okay? I'm not using too much jargon. People were 5 times as likely to spontaneously offer to help the passers-by in front of the building on the left versus the building on the right. And there's more. I won't. Oh, hang on, this has gone wrong. Our brains just don't look at long blank walls. So this is some work done by an American architect we're starting to work with. These colours show what... I'm sorry, it's very tough for you guys because you can't see any of the pictures. You're very clever, you'll work it out. This is literally, what do people look at? You look at the windows, you look at the doors, you look at the cornices, you look at the stuff. Most of us, if we're given a big sheet of blank glass, literally don't look at it, or not for more than a second or so. If you look at the little pot plant round the corner. Now, the good news is, if you build places, and Rachel touched well on this, if you build places that are walkable, human scale, which can be very high density, that can be up to 200 homes per hectare very easily without it feeling a stretch, 4, 5, 6, 7 stories, that's very, very human scale. If you build human scale, walkable, attractive, strong sense of places, it's worth more. And if you don't believe me, here's the first study. I'm going to cite 2. This is a Dutch study. I love this one because architects, I'm very unpopular with some architects, and architects often say to me, or at least some have said to me at least twice, oh, the British. I wish the British were the Dutch. The Dutch aren't, they're not small-minded and pettifogging conservative. The Dutch, they embrace new design. They're not like the English. The problem is, the best study on this was done in Holland, and it was done on the urban extensions, and it showed the places that were done not just in a traditional urban framework, but actually with, I guess, if you like, pastiche design, were worth on hang on, let me remember the number, 15, yes, they had a 15% price premium adjusting for everything else. So it's not true for Holland, And it's not true for England too. This is part of a study we did that we published last year. We looked at every single property transaction in 6 British cities in 2016. We then did a multivariate analysis back to urban form. This results for London, and just exposure here, London with the strongest results for several reasons. So you won't get quite such a strong response in the other cities. I'll just say that publicly now, because I'm going to cite the London evidence. The areas which had a high offering of pre-1900 properties that were proximate to a listed building had a value premium, holding other things equal, so taking account of connectivity, that was 4 or 5 times greater than the new build premium. So it's not just that we say it in opinion surveys, it's not just that we have found it in every single one of the visual preference surveys or in-depth engagement with residents across the country, and indeed in Ireland and in another country we have run. You actually see it in the big data pricing as well. And beauty and being in a place that we find attractive, and that is predictable, is also good for our health. The data on this is still emerging. This was a study done, I think, on 1.5 million ratings done through whatever thing that people use for photos and phones, and then linking back where people uploaded photos and where they thought were nice to look with public health. And there was a relationship between the places that people thought were more photogenic and people's health. There's more studies on this as well. Now, how do we fix this? And I'm afraid I've only got about minus 10 seconds now. This isn't hard. There is a really serious design disconnect. And what I mean by that, you talked about 3 architects, a pride of architects, or a gaggle, whatever the collective noun is, I don't know.
A nightmare.
A nightmare, yes. Well, this is very interesting you say that. I'm sorry for any architects present. I was pulled out the other day because I was giving a talk in Ireland, and I said some of my best friends are architects. And someone said I sound like some 1970s racist, so I apologise for that. This is a Twitter feed study that we did, asking people what would you be most inclined to support being built 10 of on a brownfield site near you. And as you can see, we got 87% support for 2 buildings and 13% for 2 others. We also asked people what they did. So of the 13%, you can probably guess where this is going, nearly half were architects, planners or professional designers, whereas just over 20% were of the whole thing. And again, we're not the only people who found that. A brilliant man called David Halpern did a brilliant study about 25 years ago, where, I'm sorry, this is going too long, just give me five more minus seconds, where he looked at, actually he was researching how we respond to images. And he did it on faces and he did it on buildings. And he did it with students again because they're cheap. And he found that actually how people respond to faces was fairly predictable, but how people responded to buildings was bifurcating into 2 groups. You had when you looked further, he found you had the non-architecture students and the architecture students. And the longer they had been architecture students, the more diverse they were, the more away they were from the rest of the student body. So we're finding a predictable difference between what professional designers and everyone else feels. Most of us are less, are more comfortable with a different urban form. So that's the first thing. We need to find a way to fix that. The second thing we need to find, and I'm only going to touch on this now, but this is incredibly important. We have a really comparatively strange planning system. This is the name of the primary permission you need in pretty much every European country. Those of you who are eagle-eyed will note that only in England or Britain and Ireland is it called planning permission. That's because only in Britain and Ireland has your right to build a home been nationalised. In statist France, it is regulated. What you can build is regulated, but is also therefore predictable. So we don't have, you touched on this is why I agree with your logic, we don't have these barriers to entry to the self-build, the custom build, self-build, a great champion of self-builders in the room, to the smaller developer that we see systemically in the British system, where the most important person for a normal developer most of the time, it is not the end user, it is not the market, it is what the planning system will permit. And that isn't an attack on state involvement, it is an attack on a bad regulatory system that fails all the good regulation tests of being predictable and fair and not creating barriers to entry. A developer said to me the other day, the worst thing that could happen to a development planning process, that expensive planning application, was that the development officer changed. Just think about that for a second. That is outrageous. It should not be dependent on the... No, I know lots of planners, and I have enormous sympathy for them. They are very overworked. But it should not be dependent on the individual judgment of an individual human. There will always be special cases, and we need to have, if you like, the system we currently have for the special cases and the weird stuff. But for the normal, bog-standard houses, streets, we need to have a more straight-through and predictable system that is well aligned to, hang on, this has gone again, to delivering what people like. So that's really it. And we can do this. We're starting to do it with good landowners. This is the Nans Leddon development in Cornwall. This is the Marmalade Lane development just down the road from here near Cambridge. And just a final thing, and I promise I'll shut up. And here's the evidence, the final evidence that I think this is true. Developers use the language of standard urbanism and traditional design, but they just don't mean it. So this isn't a garden. Calling it Vauxhall Gardens doesn't make it a garden. Now, I asked he was 6 at the time, my 7-year-old whether he thought this was a square. It's not a square. Calling it a village doth not a village make. Calling it human scale does not make it human scale, only if you're in some Brabnokian territory. And then my favourite, this actually one from the other day, calling a tower Canaletto does not make it the Canal Grande, ladies and gentlemen. We should be creating streets. You'll get a beautiful, gentle density in which humans will prosper and which will make the heart sing. If you do that, you don't destroy the barriers to housing, but my God, you undermine them. Thank you very much indeed.
Hands up if you're an architect.
Sorry. Never personal.
It's not a safe space.
No, it's not a safe space. So I've been booed for a version of the same talk, so thank you for not booing.
I wanted to ask the panel one question before we go to the Q&A, because we have around 20-25 minutes. We've got a big room to talk about the planning system. It's astonishing. So, where is the fight for good design and style most pressing? Where is it? We were talking earlier. I was brought up in a village, and I think the village I was brought up in was ugly. It was terrible. But then I live in Brixton now. I think it's quite well designed. I quite like it. Where would you say is, Rachel? Where would you say is the fight for design and style most pressing?
So I was sort of thinking about that as we were talking, and I was thinking about the examples that Nicholas has been giving, and also the examples of, when we talk about the Barrett box, no offense to Barrett, but like when we talk about the Barrett box and those kinds of properties, those are the kind of urban extension properties that are kind of largely on greenfield developments. Those are not the brownfield infill developments, which I think potentially are easier to get right because you're integrating something into something because you're doing, whereas actually getting something completely new in a completely new space is more difficult. But at the same time, if you think about Metroland and how you had these kind of single house types that I'm going to go choose the Fairfax or the Windsor or the whatever, that was also kind of a much more sort of standardized design, which we now value and like. So I feel like there are different kind of movements within architecture, without getting into like modernism versus pastiche versus whatever. But there are different things that we come to value, and I guess the question is, what are the features of the estates that we're building now that we will come to value in the future, and how do we get more of that and less of kind of bad standardization, if that makes sense?
Richard, do you think British people care about architecture in the same way French, Italian?
Yes, I do, fundamentally, of course. But I think there is a key difference here between a greenfield site being developed at low rise, and generally, of course, they are developed and built upon by the big major house builders. Whereas actually the brownfield sites, very often, particularly in the higher value areas, are developed by smaller developers, possibly using different forms of funding, and they have a greater interest and a greater financial ability to use good design. And I think there is a bit of a fundamental difference there. And I think also people in urban environments are more willing to accept different types of designs on brownfield sites. The real issue, I think, is how we get better design when we do need an urban extension. But I come back to my previous point, how I finished my talk, which is I think there's so much more we can do on brownfield sites before we need to resort to significant urban extensions all over the place, which very often happens because a lack of creativity and leadership on what we can do on the brownfield sites.
Nicholas?
Which question do you want me to answer? But I think the design matters. I think it's about getting, there are elements of design that are predictably popular. Variety in a pattern, human scale, walkable architecture that fits in. That doesn't mean, it really doesn't mean that it needs to look like it was built in 1820, but it does mean that it needs to sort of talk to some degree to what's there and create a pleasant urban or semi-urban environment to walk through. I don't think from memory that any of the polling we've done exposes a strong difference between urban to rural. Women are slightly more small c conservative than men on this. Poorer people are slightly more small c conservative than richer people. As I say, I can't remember a rural versus urban distinction. Our anecdotal experience, for what it's worth, is that I think, Richard, you're right, that people in bigger cities are more accepting of heterodox variety. That's perhaps not surprising. Certainly the work that we've done in county towns or further out of London, I think a bit more small c conservatism. But I mean but I think design matters to all of them. And you can see in the polling, people say design matters, and they think it's important pretty up and down the patch.
Okay, great. I'm going to go to the audience, and I want lots of questions from architects, please. If we do a round of two, so the gentleman in the blue, and then the lady. Yeah.
Good afternoon. I have the fortune, maybe turning into misfortune, of living in a town in Surrey, which in the last 50 years has trebled 3.5 times its population due to pressure on planning authorities to build more and more and more houses. The problem is now that there just are no more brownfield sites. We're fortunate in that the City of London Commons has a big chunk of land which they refuse point blank to build on. But the question is, the pressure is still there to build more and more and more. We're, 40 minutes by South Western Railways when they're not on strike into Waterloo. And because the policy seems to be to put all the commerce and industry into London, the pressure on more and more houses is rising. If you go,
what was your question?
Talking about France, Germany, even the Netherlands, they do not have the pressure to put all their development into their capital city. And that's where we're going wrong, and that's the question we are not tackling.
Okay, and then the lady with the glasses on her head.
Thank you. I'm a district councillor. I've sat on a planning committee for some time, and it's surprised me how little design has been at issue in our deliberations. It's almost never even a feature of why something comes in front of us. So yes, it does mean that just one person has decided that the design of a building is fine and it might be in front of us for other reasons. I find that quite depressing. So I'd like to know your views about that. The other thing is we do have a stranglehold of big developers. Where I'm from in South Cambridgeshire, we are generally building, and certainly have in the last 5 years of having no five-year housing land supply on large greenfield sites. I don't think we get ugly houses, I think we get very mediocre houses, and I think it's the mediocrity that allows them to slip through the system, and I'd just like to know what you have to say about that.
I'm going to go to Richard first.
I mean, I think you're right. You've completely validated what I said, which is that sadly design is not really a criteria for refusing a consent, and it doesn't come up in the planning meetings. In a sense, if it had been done properly within the planning department with a consultant architect, then much of that work would have been done before it comes to you. But you as a councillor on the planning committee should still have a say in that and should be part of that consultative process, and that would make a huge difference.
Rachel, I know you disagree on the consultant architect point.
So I think my concern about the consultant architect point is one view of something makes me nervous. So one architect's view of what is going to be good makes me quite nervous. Design review, which exists, so Cambridgeshire has the Cambridge Quality Panel, which is a bunch of architects and a bunch of other people sitting in a room looking at various designs that are coming forward and assessing them against a series of criteria to do with community, climate, connectivity, and there's a fourth one that I can't remember off the top of my head. So design review as a process is like having a consultant architect, but it's having a panel of consultant architects, but also, and importantly, planners, designers, community engagement people who are looking at the development in a kind of more 360 kind of way. Lots of architects deliver lots of terrible housing. Lots of great housing was delivered without an architect. So most Victorian terraces were not designed by an architect. They were out of a pattern book. And yet that's the thing that we keep going back to. It's like, oh, we quite like that. So yeah.
As long as it's done in a proper process as opposed to an excuse for delay.
Yes. Yeah. No, that's fair. And then I guess the question about London and housing growth housing growth and housing need in London. One of the things that the government has been doing, and the team that I'm in, the Cities and Local Growth Unit, is responsible for looking at devolution and how do you create the kind of metro mayors. You've got one in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough. How do you create the metro mayors outside of London? And that's about creating a kind of a different centre of gravity, and someone who is there to kind of stand up for and campaign for that place and that city and growing the economy. I admit that that is not 100% of the answer to London's housing problems or the greater South East's housing problems. But that is one of the steps that the government has taken over the last 8 years to really start to think about, well, how does the country work functionally, economically, as opposed to London being the kind of centre of everything. As you may have picked up from my accent, I am not local. So, I'm from America, I'm from Texas. We've got 3 big cities in Texas, but I went to college in New York and I could have lived in LA, so, and had a very similar kind of urban experience. So there is a good question there about kind of how do we make sure that the Southeast isn't the centre of absolutely everything.
The problem is it's a much longer term project than most politicians have in the agreement.
A quick response from Nicholas, and we're going to for a riposte from an architect.
I don't do quick. I'm very pleased that Rachel is not in LA and is in England helping get our planning system right. Thank you very much, Rachel, for doing that. I'll just say one very quick thing on the design point. You're absolutely right. The reason is, and I embarrassingly can't remember the name of the circular, which from memory was in 1981, and it was actually, if I may say so, it was a naive piece of Thatcherite deregulation that stopped the planning system being allowed to use design as a decision making. Now the good news is, for those who don't know, many of you will, is that the new NPPF, National Planning Policy Framework, as of July, has just reversed that. So now it is, and you should be, that is now in place. You should be, demanding of your officials that they're sorting that out. It also helpfully talked about form-based codes and design guides, and just to come back to Rachel's point about Victorian housing. Most Victorian housing, most 18th century housing, was built by a joiner or a craftsman using a book. And the book was not some random function. Certainly in London, it's a bit more complicated elsewhere. The book was a function of national statute, which said how wide houses could be or how tall they could be and what they had to be built out. So again, there's a role for the state, but the role for the state is early in the process, not at the end of the process. And we, very peculiarly, not quite uniquely, but almost uniquely, have got it at the wrong end of the process, and that's what we need to fix.
Okay, 2 more questions, please, from the audience.
You saw in the red jumper and then you in the white trousers. What?
Hi, I'd like to just take a step back into another aspect of the decision process and ask about something that I term electoral mathematics that comes into the choices that are made here. That often when we're developing sites, and it probably comes into types of housing as well, the decisions as I see them are being taken are often viewed by how many people will vote against this, because we have politicians in the process. I've been in planning meetings where politicians have asked questions like, why would someone want to live in a house like this here? My village is lovely. So how does electoral mathematics and the fact that we are making those decisions, say, late in the process, influence things, and how can we avoid that?
And the question.
I was pleased to hear your comments about the recent NPPF that will have design in it, because as somebody else who is on the District Council Planning Commission, Planning Committee, we have a situation where we will get outline planning permission being given, and yet the design can change completely from that outline planning permission. It's an utter nonsense, and we're powerless to do anything about it.
What was your question?
Well, my wider question is over the NIMBYism that we've referred to earlier. When everybody accepts that we need more housing, it just doesn't want to be built next to us. And we have a situation here where protesting groups are protesting a new village going to be built next door. We're desperately in need of the housing. And how do we address that? Because it's not about design, that's about location.
Okay, I'm going to go to Richard again first. How would we get politics or politicians out of the planning system?
Well, I mean, you're right, and I've sat in planning meetings where, for electoral reasons, a councillor has voted against or for a scheme. in theory, if they vote against, that's what the appeal process should take the politics out of it, in theory. But of course, there's a huge time delay and cost to it. But that's my experience on that. I mean, in respect of the second point, that of course, it's just the numbers thing. But question, do we explain well enough the benefits for local communities of new development that may be built next to it? And do the local communities that exist currently get enough of a benefit if they essentially are having to accept new developments adjacent to them? And from what I've seen recently, in a large experience in Gloucestershire, they probably don't.
Rachel?
Weirdly, as a civil servant, I'm going to avoid the question about taking the politicians out of politics, out of planning. Sorry.
Probably wise. Just very quickly, we did some research, which we published earlier this year, into why people are NIMBYs. There are lots of reasons why people are NIMBYs. One of them is design. One of them is infrastructure. There'll be more traffic. We'll have more parking. There'll be enough school places, doctors' places. It's also disliked that not to generalise, it won't be for people like me. And that can be at any end of the political spectrum. That can be not enough affordable housing. It can also be, though it's said more quietly, too much affordable housing and every shade in between. But running through that as a thread is, and again, Richard, you touched on this, you're great, touch base what I want to say, is the uncertainty of what it will mean. If you can box in the downside, as well as explaining some of the upsides, and most development actually has both in it, very few people are actually at any one time living in the field opposite the field that's going to be built in. But other than a few extreme cases, most good new development is associated with higher value for existing development, and we've done the numbers on that, and it's associated with more activity. That does come with some downsides. But so you need to box in the downsides, give certainty to the process, or give certainty to the outcomes and what the payments will be that will come to the local government to pay for this. And at the moment, as again several of you will know, Section 106 negotiation is complex and tortuous. SIL is minuscule. A clarity of a betterment payment, Rachel and I were discussing this earlier, so we know local government will get this and will be able to do that. So more certainty on that is ultimately the answer. The process to get there will be quite painful. We're still a long way from it at the moment.
Okay, I'm going to go for two final questions from the audience. Please wave your hand if you are an architect and want to defend your community.
How do they differentiate themselves from the people who aren't architects? She's an architect,
Okay,
but I know her, so she may not be good enough to
did we have one in the third row? Okay, so we'll definitely go to you. And then Richard Bacon.
Hi, I'm an architect and obviously quite used to all the architect bashing. How do we get developers to respect the value that architects can bring to design? Because obviously the developers are responsible for the providing the funding for buildings, and often the funding is cut to the minimum, and it obviously cramps an architect's ability to create something beautiful. So how do we get that equation more balanced? I mean, I have to say I totally agree with Richard on the brownfield site, and the fact that the government should actually give an incentive to developers in to make sort of brownfield sites more attractive. But how can we get the developers who are responsible quite a lot of the time for bad design rather than architects into more of a driving seat?
Fantastic. And then Richard.
Can the panel say who should have the most voice in what a house looks like? An elected politician, a civil servant, a house builder, a developer, an architect, or the person who is going to live in the house, whether for affordable rent or for private purchase or anything in between? And what one thing would they do to increase the likelihood of that voice being heard for whichever is their preference?
Fantastic, two great questions. I'm going to go again, first to Richard, then to Rachel, and to Nick.
I think the answer to the second question is actually let the market talk. It's a combination of all of those. It's not one specific. I think the market talks. People want to live in beautiful homes. The issue is we don't build enough of them. But I think ultimately the market should talk. In terms of the first question, how do we get developers? I think it comes back to this issue. If planners can reject schemes because the design is not good enough, that will force the developers right at the beginning of the process to get it right, and actually, if they are incentivized through an outline consent process just based on the design alone, then that really should, in some way, make real inroads into making that difference.
Rachel?
So I think that the point about making sure that the architects are kind of employed and continue to be engaged in the development process throughout is really important. I think the point that you were making earlier about why is it that we can give an outline consent and then it comes back completely different is in the same way that a planning officer can change. You can change architects. You can go with the Starchitects named firm and then come back with somebody else or maybe nobody else. And I absolutely take that. In terms of the question, Richard, of who should have the most say, I think I'm going to brutally paraphrase Jane Jacobs, who the housing minister said was one of his biggest inspirations, so I was very excited. That cities work for everyone only when they're designed and created by everyone. So I think I wouldn't probably go down let the market choose, but actually it is a combination of how do we get people engaged in engaged in housing design processes, both for the houses that they're going to live in, but also the houses that they're going to look at. So this is about the community being engaged in the design process. It's not just individual, it is a collective, but that's also about all of us as people engaged in the designing and building of new houses, being kind of thinking of ourselves both as individuals and also as professionals. So my background's in urban design, I'm a planner. And now I'm a civil servant, but actually I'm also a resident and I'm somebody who's engaged in my kind of local community around, what are we building? How are we building it? And it's important, I think, that we all kind of take personal responsibility as well as collective responsibility for what it is that we're designing. We get what we put in, right? So yeah, that's probably enough from me.
Nicholas.
In a way, my answer to both questions is the same. My instinct is to say it's the end consumer, but it is more complex than that, and Rachel jumps on some of those correctly. Look, certainly in a town or a city, if I own house A and Jack owns house B, and I turn my house into an iron smelting works, or a late night disco, or a brothel, or I build it up to 55 stories, there's an externality. As a simple statement of fact, regardless of your political philosophy, it is true that for time immemorial, cities, city government, town government, have found that something that the state or local government manages and regulates. To some degree what you can use your land for, certainly for noxious uses, and to some degree what you can build there. So whether you like it or not, I think that is just something that happens. So then the question becomes, how do we do that well? So when it comes to the new building or the infill or the new urban extension or new greenfield, perhaps is a bit different. My instinct is to say, and this comes back to controlling the developer, set the form-based code. This is what you can do around here without needing to apply for the planning permission. X stories, the following 5 materials, the following facade pattern. As long as you're within that carapace, you don't need permission. It is literally tick box. Self-build can do it, custom build, small market entrance, the big developers. We're not quite setting the land price, but we're just allowing anyone to come in because there's much more clarity about what you're allowed to build. You don't need to risk planning permission. So ultimately, it's not quite just the individual homeowner, it is the community into which their home is coming. If it's a new community, I think it gets a little more complex. And ultimately, that's how you control the developer and give me as a property owner, or you as a renter, or he or she as a tenant, or them as a custom build group or a collective, actually nearly the same access to the market as Mr. Tony, not yet Lord Pitchley, bless him.
So I think to wrap up, I would quite like to actually pose Richard's question, which is who should have the most voice in, I guess, defining what good design and style is. To the audience, can we do a show of hands? I'll remind you of Richard's option.
Rachel and I put in another one.
Well, we had, if you had to choose one, so elected politicians, house builders, planners, architects, or the individual, the one who lives in the home. So
the form-based code of the community.
And the local community.
Thank you, thank you everyone.
So, politicians. That's a big zero. House builders. I mean, that's astonishing. For a private market, we don't want the organisation that produces the goods to have any control of it.
Because we've seen the results.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an astonishing situation to get to. Then planners. One for planners. Two for planners. Fourthly, architects.
The architects are voting for themselves.
There's a lot of abstentions so far.
The individual, the person who lives in the home. Okay, that's 5 more hands, and then the local community.
Just carried the room.
Yeah, pretty much definitely.
We
Okay.
carried the room. Thank you. Well done.
Thank you very much. That was a great conversation, and can we thank the speakers in the normal way?